The orbiting station, known as the Interstellar Cultural Exchange Academy, moved silently above the pale blue curve of the neutral planet below its halls, alive with voices from across the galaxy. The station was filled with species who looked nothing alike, who spoke in different rhythms, who carried different scents, but who shared one purpose: to learn about each other and avoid future wars through understanding. Among the new arrivals was a young human named Leo, his steps calm, his expression curious as he moved through the bright corridors, wearing the soft gray uniform of Earth's Diplomacy Division. He did not carry weapons, he did not stand tall with pride. Instead, he carried a small notebook and looked around as if he wanted to listen to everyone before speaking to anyone. His presence was simple and quiet, and because of that, many overlooked him in the beginning. From the other side of the arrival platform, Rika stood watching the humans, her skin faintly iridescent, shifting with blue and gold, depending on the light. Her species came from a world where life was hard and survival was harder, and long ago, their biology had taken a path most outsiders found disturbing. In her culture, after mating, the female consumed the male. This was not cruel to them. It was natural, efficient, and ensured the strongest genes were passed on. Every species had its ways, and to her, this was as normal as breathing. But now here she was, her eyes fixed on Leo, the human who had introduced himself to the class earlier with such ease, who laughed softly when others stared at him, and who never raised his voice even when being asked strange questions. The thought that human males and females stayed together after mating was something Rika could not process. Her instincts screamed that it was wasteful, dangerous, and weak. Yet there Leo stood, calm, unafraid, curious, and so very alive. Their first conversation happened near the learning garden, a space filled with plants from many worlds. Some glowing, some floating, some humming softly. Rika approached Leo without hesitation, her voice sharp with curiosity. She asked him what she had wanted to know since the first lecture. Is it true that human males survive mating? Do you not eat them? Leo blinked, not with fear, but with confusion. Then realization dawned on his face, and he gave a small laugh, not mocking, just surprised, and he explained, "No, we do not do that. In our culture, males and females often stay together for life or for many years. We raise families together. We support each other. We do not consume one another." Rika's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with disbelief. She asked again, "Why would you allow the male to live if his role is finished?" And Leo answered slowly, "Because to us, mating is not just for survival. It is for connection, love, companionship. It is not the end. It is the beginning." That night, Rika sat alone in her quarters, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what she had heard, thinking about the quiet voice of the human who looked weaker than the males of her species, who did not carry armor or fangs, who did not boast or fight yet, who claimed something so strange, something she had never considered before, that maybe strength was not always about dominance or control. Maybe it was about staying beside someone instead of devouring them. She slept without dreams, but her thoughts refused to rest, and something deep within her had started to shift. Something quiet, something dangerous, something new. The academy followed a strict cycle of learning, interaction, and observation. Each day began with shared lectures, followed by cultural practice modules, and then open dialogue hours where species could ask questions directly and without fear of offense. It was during one of these open dialogue sessions that the tension began to rise, not because of conflict, but because of curiosity. Pressed too far, Rika had not let go of the thought that lingered since her first conversation with Leo. She had been raised in a society where survival came before sentiment, where emotion was weakness, where attachment was a risk, and yet she had seen something unsettling in the human's eyes. A kind of quiet confidence that made no sense in the world she approached the open hall that day with her posture tall, her voice ready, and her question prepared. She did not care who listened, she simply wanted the truth. She walked straight to the center of the discussion circle, where several species sat or floated or curled depending on their biology, and without hesitation, she looked at Leo, who had just taken a seat near the back, and asked him in front of everyone, "If a human male survives after mating, what stops the female from replacing What is the logic of keeping something past its usefulness? Is it not a drain on resources? The room went still, voices paused, antennae, tilted eyes blinked. The silence was not awkward, it was thick with expectation. Leo stood not quickly but without fear. He moved to the center slowly, his steps deliberate, as if choosing each footfall with purpose. And when he spoke, his words were not loud, but they carried weight. In our species, he said, value is not only measured by strength or utility, it is measured by connection, by loyalty, by care. When two humans come together, they are not just thinking of survival, they are thinking of partnership and building a life together, raising young together, facing the world together. The presence of the other becomes a source of strength, not a weakness. Rika stared as if he had spoken a language older than time. Her mind tried to twist his meaning into something logical, but it refused to fit the framework. She knew there was no rule, no genetic directive, no social law that could make sense of this idea: to give rather than take, to stay rather than conquer, to cherish rather than consume. It was alien in every sense, and yet it stirred something in her mind that felt almost like warmth, almost like longing. Others began to speak, not to mock, but to question. They asked about monogamy, about love, about heartbreak, about jealousy, about family. Leo answered each one with simplicity and care, his voice painting a picture of a species not perfect, but determined to build bonds instead of tearing them down. And the more he spoke, the more Rika began to feel a strange pressure in her chest, a quiet echo of something she could not name. After the session, Rika did not speak, she did not approach him. Instead, she went to the observation dome where stars passed slowly overhead and sat without moving. The stars reminded her of the cold logic her kind worshipped, endless and efficient, always consuming, always expanding. But now she wondered if something could exist that was not built on dominance or hunger, but on choice and trust in time. She sat there long after the others had gone, and for the first time in her life she did not feel superior or proud or certain. She felt small, and she felt curious. And she felt afraid, not of humans, not of Leo, but of the part of herself that wanted to understand them more deeply. And far away in his quiet room, Leo wrote something in his notebook, a few words, nothing dramatic, just a single sentence about a question asked in the silence that followed, and how sometimes silence speaks louder than fear. The days moved forward, and with each passing cycle, the Academy's grand halls seemed to breathe with growing tension, not of war or politics, but of quiet change. The kind that begins in minds before it ever shows in words, the kind that stirs beneath logic like roots spreading through unknown soil. Rika no longer walked with the same unshaken confidence she once had. Her steps were steady, but her thoughts no longer followed the same patterns. The teachings of her ancestors still lived in her veins, but the voice of the human still echoed in her mind. She began to observe humans more closely, not from a distance of suspicion, but with a hunger for understanding. She saw how they argued and then forgave, how they laughed without reason, how they touched shoulders when words were not enough, how they stayed near each other not because of control, but because of comfort. And this idea of comfort was a strange concept for Rika, whose species had survived by instinct and strength alone. One afternoon during a shared cross-species training simulation, an emergency drill was called across the Academy systems, a false alarm designed to test reaction speeds and group cohesion. The room shook, the lights dimmed, and species scrambled to form their safety units. By instinct, most beings rushed toward their own kind. But Rika's eyes searched for Leo, not because she needed protection, but because she wanted to see how he would react under pressure. She found him helping another student from a fragile aquatic species whose legs had failed in the rush. Leo did not run. He did not shout. He crouched low and lifted the creature, gently supporting it toward safety with calm strength. There was no fear in his face, only focus and compassion. When the drill ended and alarms faded, Rika approached him with no words prepared. She simply stood beside him as he helped the aquatic student onto a resting pod. And when he looked up at her, there was no surprise, only a quiet smile that did not ask questions. Later that evening, Rika requested a private cultural exchange with Leo, something rarely done outside official schedules, the Academy approved, and they met in a quiet observation chamber where light from the twin moons spilled through the curved glass walls. Leo listened as Rika spoke about her world, not with pride, but with raw honesty. She told him about the rituals of her people, the logic of consumption, the fear of weakness, the way love was considered a biological glitch that risked the survival of the dominant. She spoke without shame, but with a kind of exhaustion, as if she was finally allowed to question things she had only ever obeyed. Leo did not interrupt. He did not judge, he simply listened, and when she was done, he told her stories of his own, of families staying together for decades, of parents sacrificing their time and energy for children, of partners growing old side by side, of loss and mourning, and yet choosing to love again, not because they had to, but because they could. Rika asked him if that kind of connection ever made them vulnerable, and he said yes, and then added, but it also makes you stronger, not in the way of muscle or weapons, but in the way of meaning. When someone matters to you, you fight harder, not just to survive, but to protect the world you share with them. That sentence stayed in her like a quiet storm. It did not shake her instantly, but it moved slowly through every belief she had ever held. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how alone she had always felt, despite being part of a species that claimed strength in numbers. The kind of strength Leo spoke about was not one she had known before, and now she could not unsee it. The next morning, Rika stood before her species council representative aboard the Academy and asked a question that had not been asked in centuries. What if there is another way? What if survival is not the only purpose? What if connection has value beyond biology? Her words were met with silence, but silence is not always refusal. Sometimes silence is the beginning of change, and somewhere deep inside her, Rika felt the first fracture in the wall she had been born within. Not a collapse, not yet, but a crack wide enough to let the light in. The air inside the Academy had begun to shift, not physically, but through the weight of unspoken thoughts that passed between the different species, who had started watching each other more closely, not with suspicion, but with wonder and quiet reassessment. Rika had not intended to start anything larger than her own personal questioning, but her presence near Leo had become more frequent and more visible, and others noticed. Not just her kind, but many others too, who had lived with rigid customs, shaped by their harsh worlds. She no longer asked questions as boldly as before, because her curiosity had turned inward. Now she watched, she listened, she reflected. She began to understand that humans did not act out of a lack of instinct, but from a different instinct, one tied not to dominance or hunger, but to choice and balance. And this idea had unsettled everything she once thought unchangeable. She had begun to write down her thoughts, something her species rarely did, and she filled line after line with comparisons, not of flesh or strength, but of emotion, patience, sacrifice, and how those things could hold a society together without fear. One evening, as the sun of the neutral planet dipped low across the Academy's viewing deck, the warm orange light casting long shadows across the floor, Leo stood alone, watching the stars. He did not expect Rika to approach, but when she did, she stood beside him in silence for a long time. Then she asked, what would happen if her people changed? Would it make them weak or free? And Leo answered that change was never weakness when chosen with understanding, that freedom did not mean forgetting the past, but choosing the path forward with new eyes. They talked for hours about things that had no clear answers, about the balance between nature and evolution, about the difference between need and desire, about what it meant to care for someone without expectation. And the more they talked, the more Rika felt a strange pull inside her, not towards Leo as a mate, but towards the unknown that he represented, because for the first time she felt drawn towards something that was not rooted in survival or power, but in discovery. But not all change moves without resistance, as whispers of Rika's open discussions began to spread through the Academy. Her people grew tense, not because they feared humans, but because they feared the crumbling of tradition. Change is always met with doubt, and the older minds of her kind saw her curiosity as betrayal, they summoned her to speak in front of the internal tribunal, not to punish her, but to warn her that she was stepping beyond her role, that she was becoming too close to an outsider and allowing foreign thought to contaminate their culture. Rika stood before them not with rebellion in her voice, but with calm defiance. She spoke not of humans as superior, but as different. And she argued that strength can evolve and that to survive change must be embraced, not feared. She said that loyalty, compassion, and unity were not weaknesses, but tools of survival in a universe that was no longer wild and lawless, but connected and shared. Her words did not receive applause nor rejection. They were followed by silence and a slow dismissal, the kind that suggested her thoughts had struck deeper than the elders would admit out loud. And when she stepped out of the chamber, she felt no pride, only clarity, the weight of having chosen a path with no certain end. That night, as the academy dimmed into its resting phase, Rika walked alone until she found Leo once again in the learning garden, where the glow plants shimmered softly and the breeze machines hummed gently. He looked up as she arrived, and without a word she sat beside him, not as a questioner, not as a representative, not as a challenger, but simply as someone who had begun to understand what it meant to sit in stillness with another being, without threat, without fear, without expectation. And as the artificial stars drifted above them, she spoke in a voice so quiet it barely reached the air, and said, "Perhaps we were wrong about many things. Perhaps survival was never meant to be our only story." And Leo, who understood the long road of change better than most, simply nodded and let the silence hold what words could not explain. Time at the academy did not stop for any individual, but it always noticed when something different began to grow. And in the days that followed, Rika's quiet confrontation with her own beliefs, something invisible had started to spread, not fast like fire, but steady like water, slowly changing the shape of the shore. As it passed, students from different species began asking more questions, not only to learn facts, but to understand meaning. Even the most guarded ones who had kept to their kind began drifting toward the shared spaces, listening to the humans more closely, watching how they spoke, how they comforted, how they stayed close, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Rika continued her classes as before, but now her presence in the learning halls carried a new kind of energy, not of challenge or defense, but of calm exploration. She no longer avoided questions about her culture, nor did she rush to defend it. Instead, she explained it, and then asked others about theirs. She turned what once was a wall into a bridge, and slowly others began walking across it as well. Leo remained the same in many ways, steady, quiet, thoughtful. He did not seek attention. He did not raise his voice, but those who came to speak with him left with something different in their minds, a way of thinking that felt less like being taught and more like remembering something long forgotten. It was not power, it was not logic, it was something gentler and deeper that left its mark without force. One day, the academy announced a closing ceremony for the current cycle, a tradition where representatives would share something they had learned or experience something that had shaped their understanding during their time at the academy. Rika was not on the list of speakers. She had not requested a slot. She had no plan to stand on a stage again. But when the final speaker finished and the hall began to shift toward dismissal, Rika rose and walked calmly toward the front. Her steps neither rushed nor hesitant. Elders did not stop her, and the students leaned forward not out of duty, but because they wanted to know what she would say. She stood without notes, without armor, without the sharpness she once wore, like a second skin. And when she spoke, her voice carried not command but clarity. She said that once she believed survival meant being the strongest, the most efficient, the most feared, that love was a flaw, that attachment was a risk, that to consume was to preserve power. But then she had listened not to lectures, but to lives. And in them, she saw something she had never been taught, a strength that came not from conquest, but from care, from staying, from choosing again and again, not to devour, but to grow together. She did not ask her people to change. She did not demand that her culture fall. She only said that perhaps strength was not one thing, and that evolution was not only a matter of flesh but of thought, and that those who feared change often feared the mirror it placed before them. The room did not erupt into noise. There was no applause. There were only quiet eyes and shifting thoughts. And in that silence, something important took root, not agreement, not rejection, but the space for something new. After the ceremony, as students prepared to return to their homeworlds, Rika met Leo one last time in the garden where it all began. The plants glowed as always, and the wind was soft with artificial peace. She thanked him not for answers but for questions, and he said he had learned more from her questions than from any lecture. They stood there for a long time, and though no promises were made and no futures were planned, they both knew that the bridge between them had become real, and that was enough. When Rika returned to her world, she did not try to change everything at once. She did not fight her traditions with anger. She simply began to live differently, spoke differently, taught differently, and over time, others followed, not because they were told, but because they saw, and because they wondered, and because they dared to believe that survival could be more than fear, that it could be hope and choice and connection. And far away across the stars, a human wrote another line in his notebook about a warrior who had once believed in consumption but chose understanding instead, and how sometimes the greatest change comes not from battle but from the quiet courage to question the only truth you've ever known. Story did not end with a revolution. It ended with a seed, and sometimes that is all the future needs, the end.